Okay, so it looks like I'm gonna try to do this. This is not the first time I have considered recording this. This is the most inebriated time, but essentially, I'm going to be talking about Jacksonville and some of the specific problems it has had and that it has created for itself, and how to understand what they generally translate to in normal politics, considering Jacksonville's not a very normal place, right? So, Jacksonville, right before the Civil War, was this tiny little cow trading town. There was a small district from the Spanish days of freed blacks, and there were a few plantations around, but it was a small little town. Then, after the Civil War, the town gets burnt down and is rebuilt and becomes a railroad hub when Henry B. Flagler runs his railroad down through Florida, and it becomes a sort of central shipping hub before Miami and the Panama Canal. That brief area in between the two. Miami really taking off. And during this time, Jacksonville is populated primarily with former Union Buffalo soldiers. So black Union soldiers, free blacks from the north, and from freedmen from the south, from the Union Army, are the primary population. They populate the districts of Brooklyn, and as well as Springfield after the fire, and LaVilla. LaVilla, in fact, was during the 1920s and 30s, during the Harlem Renaissance, considered the Harlem of the South. And when you think about the kinds of people and writers that were coming down from Harlem to LaVilla, and that's where they're actually, especially Zora Neale Hurston, actually doing their writing, and so many influential members of the civil rights movement, especially one of the primary founders of the civil rights movement, James Weldon Johnson, is actually, in fact, from Jacksonville, and a lot of the town's former enslaved population and its Gullah Geechee population, and later on its blues population, is a real driving force for these writers and artists. Like Ray Charles starts performing in the LaVilla district, which is just this little urban district right next to the downtown that was at one point the primary black cultural neighborhood, and it was that bustling center because it was all of the workers for the it's now the Prime Osborne Convention Center, but the Jacksonville Central Terminal, this giant, it was in fact the largest operating train station in the South during its peak. But this train station, it's the foundation not only for this historic black neighborhood and for many others, and for the town itself. It spawned the Greek district and the Chinatown was really the foundation for our red light district, which again was also in LaVilla. And so LaVilla sort of, during the 1920s and 30s, has this whole culture of the new thriving black arts, and this is reflected not only in the culture but in the fact that the word blues was first used in Jacksonville. We technically invented the blues, and we really were a driving force for the blues as well as a lot of other forms. There was a huge amount of jazz influence in Jacksonville. And then, urban revitalization and renewal, as well as, the building of freeways and gentrification. In other parts of the country, a lot of times you'll see cities struggle with redeveloping their black neighborhoods, and a lot of times these cities will go to great lengths, by one means to really push that black neighborhood into the ground. And so Jacksonville did when it built the built the freeway down the middle of LaVilla. But the neighborhood persisted. Even after as well, they moved the train station to the other side of town, and when they started, pushing all of the actual industrial railroad jobs into the white districts in the far north regions of the city, the district is still pulling along. There's a lot of lounges and clubs. So eventually, the city gets sick of these normal processes to destroy historic neighborhoods. I mean, they had used these successfully to dismantle the rich historic black mansions and the historic black wealthy district of Sugar Hill near downtown. But since it wasn't working with LaVilla, the next best option was in the 1990s, the early 1990s, the local government under the then mayor Ed Austin, who also may or may not have participated in the violent 1965 Axe Handle race riots on the white side. He specifically outlines a huge amount of the city budget to be put under the River City Renaissance program, project, I believe. Sorry. And this River City Renaissance was going to revitalize the urban core and help infuse it with more vitality and life. So they spent a huge amount of the budget building this large shopping mall near the downtown called the Jacksonville Landing. You may remember it from the mass shooting earlier this year. I just dated the video. But you may also remember it, if you're from Jacksonville, as that sort of dodgy, rat-infested place where there was the Hooters in the middle of downtown that your parents used to take you to because they used to have cool things in it, and it's totally dead now. But that was part of the River City Renaissance plan, as was some improvements to the Prime Osborne Convention Center, as well as the Times Union Performing Arts Building, which, to be fair, is a perfectly good performing arts building. But the rest of that budget was actually prioritized for the demolishing and destruction of the entire LaVilla district for almost every single building on every city block, through the use of all sorts of means. They evicted the entire neighborhood and dismantled the entire thing, with the exception of the Ritz Theater, and 2 or 3 buildings that had been labeled as historic, presumably in the early 80s or late 70s, which the city then allowed to burn down on their own. The neighborhood was completely destroyed. Many of the poorest residents were forced to take up lodgings at the now defunct Ambassador Hotel, which the city later also shut down and evicted them from. But when the city tried to destroy that district, they constructed this, there was one person, who actually took his money and decided it would be best invested in protecting and preserving the neighborhood and its culture. So this man, Mr. Whetstone, actually purchased a building. I believe it was originally a grocer, made it his house, and filled it with all of the mannequins and mosaic tiles, mirrors, and statues that he could find, anything from the neighborhood as it was being demolished. All these, landmarks on the buildings and little, symbols. He took them all and he put them all around the house. So there was this building downtown that was covered in, these wonderful objects and reminders. It looked like this odd art piece. And the man even had a mural done of his and his father's life, in the house. But that's all that's left of the entire neighborhood, is of this center of black culture in the South, this historical mode for so much of America's development. It's just some abandoned, now crumbling and ready to be demolished building, owned by no one, as the children of Mr. Whetstone don't seem too interested in continuing the legacy, and there's no public plans to take over the building or to stop it from crumbling. Not that Jacksonville has really any interest in stopping public goods from crumbling. And so the entire neighborhood is now grass lots, and downtown is empty and devoid of life, and all of the residents are out, and people are still debating, how do we revitalize downtown? How do we make it a place people go to? The answer is, it's too late. You've killed it. There was a deep and concerted effort to destroy it. It took a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of people working very diligently to dismantle an entire community, an entire home for many, many people. And with all that effort, nothing was constructed that added any value. It's not like we even got the core idea of gentrification. There wasn't, no one came over and then built a new neighborhood on top of it and just excluded all the old residents. they thought it was better to just leave it dead than to allow the residents to, continue being there. And so, when you think about that, as well as all of the other developments that go along with the work of destroying a neighborhood and in the process killing your downtown. And Jacksonville's really full of this. It's a very self-destructive community. If you look at its historical trends, obviously almost all of its wealth and productivity throughout history has been derived through its connection to the rail industry. All of its early neighborhoods were streetcar districts. Its original economic center point, was the railroad. And Jacksonville has completely lost sight of this. Nowadays it's known almost entirely for how full of cars it is and how there's no effective public transportation to get around at all. And at one point, it was entirely built on this rail transportation. And I think that it's important to note this because Jacksonville actually still owns several of the lines that connect between, say, St. Augustine and as far north as the airport. There were old railroad lines there from FEC, the first, Florida East Coast Rail or something like that. First East Coast Rail or something like that. And in spite of the fact that they own miles of this line between these two cities that are, very close and would benefit greatly from effective transportation in between them, because right now, there's just a few highways and they're always backed up and there's always accidents and traffic. And so having a consistent form of public transportation that would be quick, reliable, and improve the property values and the density, in between where it's really been lacking. There were studies done 10 years ago that the city spent millions of dollars on that proved demonstrably that through very minimal amounts of work done onto these lines to fit them up for an effective commuter rail line, that it would be a huge boon for the city and dramatically achieve a lot of transportation goals, as well as improved development for the entire region. And it was shown to be a really great investment for the city, and truly to be very feasible. And several neighboring cities, as well as many companies, private rail companies, all signed on, excited to support the project to build this commuter rail line between the Jacksonville airport to downtown, and from downtown to St. Augustine. And yet, if you talk to anyone from City Hall, they act as if it's the most bridge to nowhere plan they've ever heard of, that it's completely unrealistic, and that it's impossible and totally out of their hands, when at the same time they're willing to spend millions of times more on ridiculous, street construction that will take decades and never produce any value for the city and only reduce tax revenue and density and all these things the city needs to function, and instead replace it with urbanization, urban sprawl, and traffic. And the reason that they're willing to spend more doing that, the reason they're willing to spend hundreds of millions on, the destruction, demolishing, and the bulldozing of so many historic buildings downtown and so much historic density downtown, with no interested offers replacing those lots at all, and no reason to believe that this spot will ever be filled, is because the whole idea of what is realistic, politically speaking, is completely divorced from any sort of reasonable, reality-based projection of what would be feasible. The idea of political realism has nothing to do with how cheap or effective or popular a policy might be. It only has to do with whose interest it serves. And if it serves yours, chances are it does not serve the interests of wealthy people who make these decisions. And as a result, completely useful, helpful policy is squandered and thrown away, and our communities lie far worse because of it. Because there's no one here sitting back and actually saying, wait a fucking minute, we don't have to tolerate this. We don't have to just sit back and accept an inadequately built society and an inadequately built community. We can do better. And I think it's really disappointing to see so few people clamoring to do better. And when you look at a place like Jacksonville, you can start to understand exactly why and how it's done. And the idea is essentially to just convince people that they should never expect anything better. If you look at Jacksonville and the people that live there, they're miserable, and they often complain about how poorly and inadequately run their city is. They complain about the politicians that don't listen to them. They complain about the fact that for decades the political management of the city has been fraudulent and filled with con men and absolute corruption. I mean, there are books from as far back as the 60s that document the involvement of corruption in the incorporation of the city. And then in the 80s, day-to-day journals published, for God knows what reasons, of Jacksonvillians focus entirely on how miserable and corrupt the city is and how it makes it completely incapable and insufficient to address the needs of a modern city in the future. I mean, Jacksonville cannot be the bold city of the South if it's not willing to be bold or a city, and the only thing it wants to be is Southern when it's not. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that you should really take a critical eye, first of all, to what you assume is politically realistic. Because just because something seems realistic doesn't mean it's actually useful, a good way to spend money, or in fact reasonable or affordable. And just because something may not be referred to as reasonable or affordable does not mean that it is not, in fact, quite affordable and quite reasonable. On top of this, do not assume that just because, you haven't heard of your city doing something interesting, that it's not. Cities are always active, vibrant places, and especially with a place like Jacksonville, that just means that you have to scratch underneath the surface and pull out all of the interesting and fascinating information about it. And most importantly, do not allow your city to just sort of be controlled from the shadows by people no one has ever heard of or people have no awareness of. Don't allow your city to be taken over by the interests of people who basically exist only as some sort of abstract concept of power. It's not an effective form of governance. Take an interest and pride in actually attending to the history and to the current day-to-day politics of your city, because it will affect your life far more than any of the ramshackle nonsense arguments that you're going to interact with on a daily basis out there beyond your city, in the national or even just the state level.